All right, so we're going to go ahead and start the review of Chapter 5. And as I was just saying, if you have any questions, just jump in. I'll go ahead and share the screen for the quiz. I'll walk through that. But if there are any specific questions, I think I just shared the wrong screen. If there are any specific questions, let me know as we're jumping through. So I'll start right here. Commonly, a solar panel in a standalone system will be described as a 12-volt or a 24-volt panel. When referenced in this manner, we're talking about the panels, and here we're looking for nominal voltage. And basically, the nominal voltage, if we say it's a 12-volt panel or a 24-volt panel, it doesn't mean it's going to function at 12 volts or 24. It typically means it is compatible with a 12-volt battery system or a 24-volt battery system. And even the battery doesn't operate at 12 volts or 24 volts. It operates within a range. You know, a battery that's empty is going to be like a 12-volt battery is going to be about 11.3. A full battery is going to be about 12.9. So, but we would refer to that as a 12-volt battery. That's just this nominal term. And it's like a shorthand, just a shorthand of saying, so a 12-volt panel is compatible with a 12-volt nominal battery, so on. But none of them operate at 12 volts. Okay, that's not confusing at all, right? The highest voltage a panel can generate under standard test conditions is, with no load connected, is referred to as the panel's, and it's its open circuit voltage. Okay, so the open circuit, or the VOC, and that is the highest possible voltage that panel might produce under standard test conditions. And that's an important caveat because you know, that standard test conditions say that the panel is in a 1,000 watt per square meter irradiance and a temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. Well, sometimes it gets colder than 25, so it may be producing more voltage. So again, open circuit voltage is not the maximum that panel may ever produce. It's just the maximum it may produce under standard test conditions. So later, when we start doing some of the math, you'll adjust for temperature to get to what is the absolute maximum. The ratings noted on most solar panels are the result of lab testing using standard test conditions. And the whole purpose of a standard test conditions is to provide apples to apples. So you want to know that one 300 watt panel is going to produce a similar amount of power to another 300 watt panel. So they need to be tested under identical conditions, and we just set those conditions as standard test conditions, which is 1,000 watts per square meter, atmosphere of 1.5, and 25 degrees Celsius. So those are the conditions. Doesn't really matter what conditions are being used as long as everyone's consistent. And so we've gone to standard test conditions. As the temperature of a PV array rises above 25 degrees, the panel will produce more power. It rises above, it'll produce less power. So the colder it gets, the more power the panel will produce, which is a little bit counterintuitive because we think about like desert environments as being the best because there's a lot of sunshine. But actually the heat will make that a little less effective. So one of the best places for solar is like on the lee side of the Rocky Mountains, up in Colorado, where there's a lot of sunshine, but it's very cold temperatures. So cold is better for electricity. And there's some videos in here that'll show some of the effect of that. Today, most solar panels incorporate MC4 connectors, and that just stands for multi-connector 4mm. That's just the standard connector that is in the marketplace today. You may see some MC3s out there in the field, but you're not allowed to install those new. You don't have to take them out if you run across them, but you should put in MC4 connectors. Which is the largest diameter wire of these four? Well, once again, counterintuitively, the smaller the number, the bigger the wire. So 0 gauge is bigger than 2, and 2 is bigger than 6, and 6 is bigger than 12. Typically in our field, I always recommend that you don't use anything smaller than 10 gauge because first off, the difference between 10 gauge and 12 gauge is minuscule as far as price, but you never get in trouble using bigger wire. So 10 gauge is just a good rule of thumb. Don't use anything smaller. Which of the following will carry the biggest current of these four? Well, the bigger the wire, the more current it will carry. So once again, and a 0 gauge wire is a pretty big wire. You know, like 4/0, 4 zeros, 0, 0, 0, 0 is going to be about the size of my finger, the copper conductors. So, you know, it's a pretty good sized wire. 4/0's pretty much the biggest wire you're probably going to be dealing with unless you get into commercial systems. When selecting with the appropriate wire gauge, which is of greater concern or greatest concern, the price, its ampacity rating, its resistance rating, or its voltage rating? Well, in this case, we're worried mostly about ampacity because if you exceed the ampacity rating of a wire, it can burn up, and that becomes a life safety issue. Resistance rating, if you exceed, you know, if you put too small a wire in there and you lose some of the power due to resistance, that's an economics issue. Same with price. Voltage rating, that's often going to be how much voltage will this thing transmit before it begins to emit or lose some of the voltage through the insulation. So that can be a safety issue because you would feel a tingle, you know, it would be emitting some electricity through the insulation, but it's not as important as the ampacity rating. Okay, which of the following wire insulation is rated for outdoor wet conditions? I'm just kind of giving you this. You don't have to memorize all of the insulation ratings. Like THHN, the T stands for thermoplastic, the H is like high heat, and N is nylon. So this would be used primarily in indoor hot environments like an attic. THWN, thermoplastic, high heat, wet for W. The NEC is, of course, National Electrical Code. But the right answer here is used to underground service entrance. And that's often used as a substitute for PV wire. So just don't worry about memorizing what the different insulation types are, but it's good to know that they have their place. Every situation has a wire that is best for that situation. What technology used within inverters is generally used today to closely mimic utility power and avoids problems with sensitive electronic devices? And that's going to be a pure sine wave inverter. Now, the issue with inverters, of course, is if it's tied to the grid, it has to mimic the signal of the grid exactly. Otherwise, you get harmonic distortions out on the grid. So every system that's connected to the grid has to have a pure sine wave inverter because that's what the grid recognizes. That's what the grid produces. But if you have a standalone system, you don't necessarily have to have pure sine wave. In fact, in the early days, they had square wave, and then they adjusted that somewhat for a modified sine wave. It was just breaking the squares down into bits. And that works, but with sensitive electronics, you may get some harmonic distortions, some shadows on a television screen. things like that. So the best thing is to use pure sine wave. The only reason you go with a modified sine wave is just price. They're a lot cheaper than a pure sine wave inverter. The price can be pretty dramatic. You might be able to get like a 2,000 watt modified sine wave inverter for about 400 bucks, but that same inverter might cost $2,000 if it's a pure sine wave inverter. So pure sine wave is always better, but it can be expensive. And if you don't need that kind of quality, well, then you're not going to pay for it. The charge controller handles the various stages of charging within deep cycle batteries. These stages typically include, and this is again with a pulse width modulation charge controller, and it's bulk, absorption, and float. So if you think about the way that a charge controller recharges a battery, in a standalone system, consider that the battery is at its lowest point first thing in the morning. So then 100% of the power hitting the solar array is going to be put into the battery. That would be its bulk charge. Then as it reaches about 90% state of charge, you want to slow down the charging process. So it begins to modify the width of the pulses. So if you think about, like, if it's charging and it's charging at a rate of say 10 pulses every second, in order to slow it down, it might be going 10 pulses, but then 9 are on, 1 is off. Then 8 are on, 2 are off. 7, 3, and so on. So it's kind of slowing, easing you up to a full state of charge. Then float is once the battery is fully charged, use a little bit of power, replace a little bit of power, use a little bit of power, replace it. So it's a technique that is a little bit more efficient in charging batteries and better at protecting them, because you think about full charge, full stop is hard on the battery. So you want to sort of taper in, or through the absorption charge, apply the brakes in the charging. Okay. I should have hit that button before. All right. A number 4 AWG TW copper conductor has an ampacity rating of. So what we're showing you is the NEC table with the ampacity rating. So we're saying the number 4. So we come down here to 4 gauge. So this 4 is indicating the size in American wire gauge. TW, well, TW is in the first column, this type of wire. So we go 4 gauge, TW, it's going to have 70 amp rating. So it's really just a way to learn how to use the tables. If I had said, what is the rating of a THHN wire 4 gauge, I would come out here to column 3 because THHN's here, and it would have a rating of 95 amps. So higher heat wire has better ampacity rating at higher temperatures. So now one thing, and this is not asking you in this question, but the connection, the wire connection, is not just the wire itself, but it also includes the points where it connects to the equipment. So for instance, if I'm running a wire from the solar array or from a combiner box to the charge controller, I have not only the ampacity rating of the wire, but I have the ampacity rating of the screws and connection points in the combiner box and in the charge controller. Well, unless I have both of those pieces of equipment and I can look up what is its temperature rating for that connection point, I have to assume that it's only 60 degrees Celsius, or basically the first column. So if I have my combiner box, I have my charge controller, and I've looked at them and it says these are rated for 90 degrees, I could go with the number 4 and I could say it's 95 amps. But if I don't know what my equipment is, I have to assume column 1 as the lowest temperature, just to be safe. So even if I were using PV wire or THHN, if I'm using a number 4 wire and I don't know where I'm connecting it, I'm going to assume an ampacity rating of 70. Hopefully that makes sense. Unless you know all the bits of the circuit, assume worst case situation. So even though you're putting in PV wire, which is a high temperature wire, assume it only has the ampacity rating of the first column, 60 degrees. And that's not a bad habit to get into, because even if you had a charge controller that was rated at 90 degrees Celsius, you might change that charge controller out at a future date with something that has a different rating. So just go with column 1 as a matter of practice. You might have to spend a little bit more money on wire, but you never go wrong putting wire in that's bigger than what is required. The only difficulty, of course, is you may spend a little bit of extra money and it might be a little more difficult to work with. All right, if the wire has an ampacity of 70 amps, like the last one, and you put it in a conduit with 14 other conductors, then what would happen? Well, we look in this table and it says if we're between 10 and 20 wires, we have to derate the ampacity by 50%. So we started with 70 amps, derating at 50%. So now it only has an ampacity of 35 amps. And that's due to heat. Okay, because of the heat that builds up due to resistance in a conduit, this is only going to now have an ampacity of 35 amps. So you have to derate your ampacity rating for wire for conduit fill and exposure to heat. If anybody has any questions as we're doing this, just let me know, because I know some of this is new to you. When selecting a standalone inverter of all the following specifications, they're all important except, all right, system nominal voltage rating. That's important, right? Because our inverter has to match the nominal voltage of our battery. The power rating, well, the power rating is basically how many watts can this thing handle. That has to match or exceed whatever the maximum power draw is for the system. The conversion efficiency, well, that's important because any inefficiency is lost power. So you want an inverter that's efficient. Anti-islanding is not important because it's standalone. We don't care. We're not going to be sending power to the grid because it's not connected to the grid. So we don't have to worry about anti-islanding. Which of the following is not an advantage of a system that includes microinverters? Well, we can use mismatched panels because every inverter acts independently of every other inverter or every other panel. The array can easily be expanded over time because we add one panel, one inverter, one panel, one inverter. So that's easy to do. Panels will not need to be replaced as often. Well, that's just not true. Microinverter doesn't do anything to extend the life of a panel, but the effect of shading is reduced because if there is shading on your array, it's isolated just to the one panel that's shaded. If there's shading on an array with the string, it's going to affect the whole string.
I had a quick question about that.
Okay.
So the shading, so like, for example, if a bunch of leaves were on like a single cell of the panel, it basically acts as like resistance, correct? Because the electrons aren't flowing through that cell, so that basically acts as resistance for the rest of the panel. Is that correct?
Yeah, in effect, well, what you're going to be doing is you're reducing the irradiance. Of course, there's not as much power hitting that particular cell, And you remember there's a thing called bypass diodes within a particular panel. Otherwise, every cell in that panel would be affected by a leaf sitting on one cell. So usually there are 3 bypass diodes, so only a third of the panel is going to be affected. But every one in that string of cells is going to be affected. And you can think about it like a choke hold on a water pipe. If I've got a big pipe, but I condense down one little spot, then the only amount of water that can flow through is the amount that can go through that one chokehold place. And so it's going to affect the entire flow within that pipe. And then if I hook up multiple panels in a string, they are all only going to produce whatever the lowest one is producing.
Right.
So one of the advantages of microinverters and power optimizers is you isolate those problems to each specific panel, as opposed to carrying it through the entire string. But I find it's easier to think about it like you've crimped in on the pipe, and now water can't flow. Even though the pipe's open the rest of the way, it's now limited. So
Great.
they
Thank
all
you.
they all work at the lowest common denominator. All right, an inverter that can function both as a grid-tied inverter as well as a standalone is called a bimodal inverter. Okay, so it acts like a grid-tied inverter while you're hooked up to the grid, but as soon as the grid goes down, it then flips a relay, and now you're operating as a standalone system. And typically, it's only going to be servicing a sub-panel, of critical loads. A number of solar panels connected in series is called a string. And that's true of panels, it's true of batteries. Anything connected together in series is going to be referred to as a string. Which of the following will not decrease the life expectancy of a battery bank in a PV system? Increase the depth of discharge? Well, that does, because the deeper you go into the battery, the more likely there is for sulfation. And the more sulfur that builds up in the battery, the less long it's going to last. Increase the heat where they're stored. When a battery is warm, it tends to overcharge, which will decrease its life. Increase the number of cycles. Well, the more you use it, the less long it's going to last. So all 3 of those decrease the life expectancy. Increasing the system voltage has no effect, whether it's a 12-volt battery bank or a 48-volt battery bank. That's not going to affect how long the system lasts. So that's the correct answer there. A capacity of a battery bank is generally measured in amp hours at C20. So this is just, again, we measure the capacity in amp hours, which is energy, and we needed a standard test condition. So we say, okay, we're going to measure it at C20, which is a rate of discharge, saying from full to empty over 20 hours, because the faster you discharge a battery, the less power, the less energy is contained within that battery bank. So if you discharge at a rate of C1, then that battery bank is going to have less energy available than if you discharge at a rate of C100. So we needed a standard test condition, so we just say at C20. Okay. Which of the following PV systems will need to incorporate a utility interface? Well, standalone is not connected to the utility, so it's a grid-tied system. Needs to have the utility interface, and that's typically going to be within your inverter. The situation where PV system is generating power to the electrical grid when the grid is down, no electricity flowing from the utility, is known as islanding. And we harp on this a lot because it's a big deal. We want to make sure that when we're hooked up to the utility, we are never generating power onto the grid when the grid is assumed to have no power. Because somebody going out to work on the line could get electrocuted. You're sending power out on the grid and they think it's dead. So, you know, they can definitely die. So all of our systems are designed to shut down as soon as the grid goes down. And except when we've got a bimodal system, which then physically disconnects from the grid and then operates as a standalone system. So that's an important concept, and that's built into the inverter rating, the UL 1741. And most of your contracts, most of your interconnection agreements are going to say you got to have a UL 1741 inverter that assures the utility you will not be broadcasting onto the grid when the grid is down. Silicon works well as a material from which to construct solar cells because, well, it's a semiconductor. And, you know, a semiconductor is really nothing more than a material that sometimes acts as a conductor, sometimes acts as an insulator. Which of the following is not a factor that affects the performance of a cell? The band gap energy characteristics. Well, that's how much energy it takes to knock the electron across the band gap. If it's too low, the electron could move back and forth. If it's too high, it takes too much energy. So typically they're going to be about 1.1 electron volts. The internal load resistance, that's what gives us the IV curve. That's important. Size of the cell, all things being equal, the bigger the cell, the more power. Its amp hour capacity is the right answer because solar panels don't have amp hours. They don't store energy. Batteries store energy. Solar panels just produce power, not energy. And remember, energy is power over time. Which of the following components within a PV system is typically not considered as part of the balance of systems? Well, typically we say the panels, the inverters, and then everything else. And that's because in the early days, those were about a third, and a third of the cost. So there were the panels that was about a third, the inverters about a third, and then everything else. Now, what's happened in recent years is the cost of panels and inverters have come down. So the balance of systems can be significant, like 50% of the cost or so. Which of the following is not a widely available type of PV cell on the market today? Well, we have monocrystalline, we have polycrystalline, we have amorphous or thin film. Bicrystalline, that's just something I made up. They're bifacial panels, but bicrystalline, no such thing. Battery C rating of C20, well, I mentioned this before. It's a rate of discharge, takes 20 hours to fully drain the battery. And the faster you drain a battery, the less energy is within the battery. So C1 has less power. That's if you're draining it over 1 hour than C100. So if you install a system and it turns out you don't have as much storage capacity as you thought, it may be because you've undersized your battery bank and people are drawing the energy out faster than over a 20-hour period. A battery bank with a capacity of 600 amp hours, well, just as watt hours equals watts times hours, amp hours is amps times hours. So we would take this, like 20 amps for 600 hours would be 20 times 600, which is what, 12,000 and something. 20 amps for 15 hours, that's 300 hours, 50% depth of discharge. So a 600 amp hour battery, 50% is 300 hours. So that's going to be the right answer. The others are not going to be correct. So that's how you would figure that one out. And I think down here in the answer we just show 20 amps times 15 is 300, 50% depth of discharge. So that's the correct answer. Did anybody have any issue with that one? That's kind of our first math question here. Okay. All right, older charge controllers used a thermostat type control known as a series controller. Today, most charge controllers use, and that's pulse width modulation, PWM. That's the ones that operate at bulk, absorption, and float. The older ones were like, okay, when you reach a charge when the charge of the battery drops below, let's say 12.5 volts, kick on, start generating power to the battery. When you reach 13.2, turn off. So it's like a thermostat. When the temperature gets below a certain, the furnace kicks on. When it gets to a certain temperature, it kicks off. Well, there's a lot of inefficiencies in there, a lot of time when the panels are generating power, but they're never being used. So the pulse width modulation is a much more efficient way of using the power within the solar panels. So that's why most have switched over to pulse width modulation. The place where multiple strings in an array are connected in parallel is called a combiner box. You're basically combining strings in parallel. And that's where you would come in, and that's used mostly for cable management. So if you had like 5 runs, you wouldn't necessarily want to run them all the way from the roof to the basement where your inverter might be. Although most modern inverters have multiple string connecting points so that the maximum power point tracking device, the MPPT, is functioning on each string independent of each other. So in today's world, we don't use combiner boxes as much as we used to. Often you're running home run, basically all the way from the array to the inverter in strings. And the reason for that is because then, like we talked about before, if you have shading on one string, if you combine all the strings, now shading on one string affects the entire array. So you might find that you have a lot less power being generated by using a combiner box. Which of the following will help minimize system damage in the event of a lightning strike? Well, we have surge protection, fuses and breakers, ground fault detection, or all of the above. Well, the answer is going to be surge protection. Why isn't it all of the above? Well, fuses and breakers do not react fast enough to deal with lightning. Otherwise, we'd never need surge protection because we all have breakers. Ground fault detection just tells you there's a problem. So it doesn't do anything to prevent the problem. So this is why we want to install surge protectors on our system, because essentially solar panels on the roof is like a big lightning attractor. So you do want to protect it. Which of the following inverters comply with the NEC 2014 rapid shutdown provision? Bimodal inverters with MPPT? Well, all inverters have MPPT, so I don't know that that's going to be it. Multimodal inverters with pulse width modulation, that doesn't make any sense. Pulse width modulation is for charge controllers. Fixed voltage inverter with power optimizers, that's basically the solar edge system, and the power optimizer shuts down the panel at the panel so that there's no power being generated. And this was basically an issue that came about as a safety issue. Let me draw you a little picture here. So the reason for this is, let's say we had a typical home, and this is the roof, and you've got a solar array up here, and there's some combiner box or something underneath, and the wires go in the attic, they come along, let's say they come down here underneath the decking, and then they go out the wall, down the side of the building, they enter in the wall, and inside here is your inverter, and that's where it's going to connect. And maybe there's an AC disconnect, whatever. So what we're trying to avoid here is when the fire department comes, let's say the house is on fire, fire department comes and first thing they're going to do is pull the meter. When they pull the meter, they're used to the idea that as soon as they pull the meter, there's no longer any electricity in the house. But they're going to see a label here on the meter that says, hey, this house has a solar array. So they look within 10 feet for the AC disconnect, and they find that AC disconnect, and now they pull the lever on the AC disconnect to turn it off. At this point, they feel that they've shut off all power sources. But if the sun is shining, the array could still be generating because it's the inverter that shuts down the power. So this wire here could be live, these wires could be live, that could be live, and these things could have like 600 volts going through them, 50 amps, whatever. So a fireman comes up on the roof with a chainsaw and cuts through the roof and cuts through the wire, and they're killed. They're electrocuted because they've cut through a live wire. So what the NEC said and the rapid shutdown says, when I pull this lever here, I want the power to shut off at the array, not down here at the inverter, but at the array. And the only way to do that is to put some sort of electronic device on each of those panels. And that's what we do. Although they could have, and they did early days, put a disconnecting combiner box. But the better solution is to put some sort of electronic device and have your rapid shutdown built into the panel. So that's what rapid shutdown is all about. It's a life safety issue for the firefighters, for first responders. That's really what that was all about. And over the years, that has got tightened quite a lot. And the rapid shutdown only applies to buildings. It doesn't apply to ground-mounted systems. Which of the following is not an advantage in selecting a lithium-ion battery over a deep cycle battery? Well, one advantage is they are a higher energy density by weight. They're not easier to recycle. In fact, at this point, we don't have an effective way of recycling them. They are more resistant to cold, and they do last longer. So basically, easier to recycle is the right answer. And there are a lot of environmental problems with lithium ion. So don't think they're the be all and the end all. They're a good transition technology, but I'm hoping for better solutions coming, like saltwater batteries. Which of the following battery types have been known to spontaneously combust when damaged? Well, that's lithium ion. We've all heard about the Galaxy 6.
Lithium ions can spontaneously combust ion batteries.
Right. So you've seen that with the Galaxy, with the hoverboards, things like that. So, and there's a nice little video here showing what will happen. It's referred to as thermal runaway, and it's basically just an inherent property of lithium ion. Of course, lead acid batteries are known to explode. So, combust, explode. It's all bad and they're usually only when damaged. In a lead acid battery, the battery's charge capacity will decrease by 1% per degree Celsius below 20, is unaffected by temperature, will decrease by 2 as it rises, or undercharge in extremely high temperatures. Well, it will decrease by 1% per degree. So the colder it gets, the less the battery will charge. So at 0 degrees, at freezing, a lead acid battery, when it reaches 80% of charge, thinks it's full. Counterwise, if it's warmer than 20 degrees, it may overcharge because it doesn't think it's full yet. So oftentimes charge controllers have little temperature probes that you'll take and stick on the battery, and then they'll measure the temperature of the battery and they'll be able to adjust their charging based on the temperature of the battery. But a good way to remember this is it's why your car won't start in the winter. Colder it is, the car may undercharge. So the lower the temperature, the less effective the charging will be. A disadvantage of saltwater batteries is, well, they overcharge and emit hydrogen gas. That's not true. That's lead acid batteries. They're very expensive, and that is the issue. When damaged, they tend to explode. Nope, that's lithium ion. They're made of toxic materials. That's lithium ion. No, they're just expensive. They're an emerging technology. I think we'll find that the price comes down as they get more widely accepted. Nickel iron batteries are often used in mining operations because they're very rugged, robust, can handle a lot of stress. So these nickel iron are also called Edison batteries, and they're just like bulletproof. They'll last for like 30 years, but they're super expensive and super heavy. What is the primary difference between a combiner box and a junction box? Well, basically a combiner box, you're typically going to hook things up in parallel, and a junction box is usually just a pass-through. So let's see, combiner, yeah, hook, well, the junction box does not. So you'll often use a junction box in your system because you're going to go from the wires that are connected to the solar panels, transition to a different type of wire when you go inside. So a junction box is a nice place to do that. It's a physical box where you can make those transitions. A combiner box, you're hooking them up in parallel, connecting all the positives to positive, all the negatives to negative. So you'll come in with many small strings and leave with only one string, but it will have a much bigger ampacity rating. And that's for wire management. But as I said earlier, we're using combiner boxes much less today than we used to, because we're often running our strings all the way to the inverter. The NEC ampacity ratings assumes wires are operating at, and here I'm gonna try and remember, I think it's at 20 degrees, might be 25, but I think it's 20 degrees. Nope, oh, 30 degrees. I got one wrong. Okay, so yeah, it assumes 30 degrees, and you'll have to make temperature adjustments if you're going to be in an environment that's hotter than that. Usually we're not much hotter than that in the United States, but if you were putting a system in Saudi Arabia, for instance, you might want to make a temperature adjustment. Or if you're putting the wire in conduit exposed to the sun, you'll have to make an adjustment. According to the National Electrical Code, when connecting to a functionally grounded inverter, which is normal, the color of the negative wire will be, and this is a little bit tricky, but it's going to be red, black, or any other color. And this, you have to go to a little bit of history on this. In the early days of solar, in the inverter, we would hook the negative wire directly to the ground. And that became known as the grounded conductor. And in the NEC, the grounded conductor is supposed to be white or gray. So that's why the neutral, for instance, an AC wire is white or gray, because it is the grounded conductor. And if you look in your circuit breaker box, you'll see that the neutrals are connected to the same bus bar, or the bus bar that's connected to the ground. But as the industry matured, we found that you started having arc fault protectors and ground fault protectors in the inverters, which were like little circuit breakers that physically separated the negative wire from the ground. So they were no longer solidly connected to the ground, but they were what was referred to as functionally connected. They're functionally grounded, but not really grounded. And the NEC says ungrounded conductors have to be red, black, or any other color. So what we've done is, because the positive needs to be red, black, or any other color, the negative needs to be red, black, or any other color, because both are considered to be ungrounded. As a matter of practice, we typically will put the red for positive and the black for negative, which is how it is in cars and things like that. So that just makes sense to people. So that is the way I will tell you to do your wiring. Red for positive, black for negative. You could do it the opposite and it would meet code, but people would be very confused. According to the NEC, the color of the positive, well, once again, red, black, or any other color. So there's not a lot of guidance there because both of them are considered ungrounded. The NEC prefers a maximum of how many disconnects for any electrical service? Well, the answer here is 6. There's the 6 handle rule that says when I show up at a building, I can't have more than 6 disconnects to turn off power to this structure. And that includes for generators, for PV arrays, wind turbines, the grid, all of those kind of things. And how they came up with 6, nobody seems to know. But I guess they decided that 6 is the most that people can deal with. If you have more than 6, let's say you're like in an apartment complex where there's a whole bunch of units and they all have to be turned off, those have to be put into an aggregation unit. So let's say there are 30 apartments, they'd all go into one where we just simply pull one handle and we've turned off all 30. So there can't be more than 6 handles for the first responders to have to turn off. And they all have to be co-located. You can't have to run around the whole compound trying to find them. They have to be at the same spot. Changes to the rapid shutdown provisions that went into effect in 2017 include, well, when the NEC disconnect is turned off, conductors within 1 foot rather than 10 feet can be energized for no longer than 30 seconds to a maximum of 30 volts. That's true. Inverters must comply with Rule 21 and be listed. That's not a rapid shutdown thing. That's a California Rule 21. So I suspect that's going to be the right answer. Within the array, no conductor can have voltage higher than 80 volts. That's true. And a label must be on the shutdown. So it's the smart inverter thing. That's a whole separate issue rather than rapid shutdown. Rapid shutdown's a little confusing. So if you're not comfortable with it, review that section because it's a big deal. It's a big deal in the industry. Inverters that comply with Rule 21 and are listed as UL 1741 SA, and SA just stands for Supplementary Addendum, are referred to as smart inverters. And these inverters simply allow the inverter to basically clean up some of the power as it flows through the system. And it allows for smarter reconnection to the grid. What they were running into is you would have a lot of inverters in a system, and let's say the grid goes down, it flickers off for a second or two, and all of your system shuts down. So if you had 100,000 inverters and they all shut down, then the inverters were designed to wait for 5 minutes exactly and then turn back on. So the grid goes down, 5 minutes later, all of these systems turn back on, and the grid then can't handle it, and it falls outside of its operating voltage range. Because remember, the grid operates a bit like water pressure. You know, if you put a whole bunch of load on it all at one time, then the pressure drops. And if it falls outside of the plus or minus 6% range that the grid operates, the grid will crash. Or if you bring a lot of solar arrays on all at once, it's like high pressure. The voltage may rise above that 6% and the grid would crash. So they were getting these cascading grid crashes. 5 minutes after it reestablishes, all the arrays come on, it exceeds its voltage, it crashes again. So smart inverters can read when the grid is ready to accept the power that they're generating. So that's part of what they do as well. And in an AC coupled or DC coupled system, the device that disconnects the PV system from the grid is called a transfer switch. Okay, the transfer switch is within the inverter. And as soon as it reads that the grid is down, it transfers from basically the main panel to just the dedicated sub panel. A 2017 NEC allows for and addresses permanently installed high voltage batteries. Is referred to as self-contained energy storage systems. And we used to say, okay, there was a limit of 50 volts for batteries within a building. but the NEC changed in 2017 to say, if you've got a self-contained system, you can go up to 100 volts. And if that cannot be accessed by the homeowner, if it requires a technician, then it can go to unlimited voltage. And that was basically a response to companies like Tesla, who wanted their power walls to be able to go to 600 volts to be compatible with the panels. The 2017 NEC allows for battery systems located within a single, so this is basically what I was just saying. It's unlimited if the homeowner cannot access any of the terminals in there. When sizing a grid-tied inverter, the size of the inverter is directly tied to the size of the array. It won't necessarily be exactly the size of the array. Usually the array is going to be bigger. That's referred to as, you know, the inverter load ratio, but it is tied to the size of the array. And a standalone inverter is basically a function of the maximum power draw. So that, because all energy, all power is being drawn through the inverter, it's based on the size of the load, not on the size of the array. Okay, so that gets us through that quiz. I think I only missed one there. So did anyone have any questions before we call it a day here? Remembering you may be muted if you had a question. Okay, all right, if any questions come up between then and now, we'll meet on Tuesday. We'll begin chapter 6. Chapter 6 is kind of fun. That's one of the site survey chapters. So I think that's a little more intuitive. But then, of course, we're going to get into chapter 7, which is really where people find themselves struggling a little bit. So spend enough time on it, because you're basically learning a new language, and all of this is new to you. So we'll meet at 1 o'clock on Tuesday, Eastern time. So thanks for your attention. See you then. All right. Bye-bye.